In the early 13th century, the heart of Central Asia stood at the crossroads of the world. Across deserts, rivers, and ancient caravan routes stretched the immense territories of the Khwarazmian Empire, a realm of fortified cities, prosperous markets, and powerful governors that controlled one of the most important commercial arteries on earth, the Silk Road. From the Oxus River to the borders of Persia, from the steppes of Kazakhstan to the mountains of Afghanistan, merchants moved through Khwarazmian lands carrying silk, spices, gold, and knowledge between east and west. It was a wealthy empire. It was a strategic empire. And in 1219, it became the target of one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. Not because of territory, not because of resources, but because of a decision, a single act of arrogance that would trigger the full fury of the Mongol war machine. And once that machine began moving, it did not stop. At the center of this story stood two very different rulers. One commanded the greatest steppe army the world had ever seen. The other ruled one of the most powerful Islamic states of his time. Their collision would erase entire cities from the map. By 1219, Genghis Khan had already transformed the political landscape of Inner Asia. Born Temujin, he had spent decades uniting the fractured nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe. Through relentless warfare, diplomacy, and an uncompromising system of loyalty, he had forged the tribes into a single military nation. The Mongol army that emerged from this transformation was unlike any other. It was mobile, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Every soldier was a mounted archer trained from childhood to fight on horseback. Every unit was organized with precise numerical command structures, tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Orders moved quickly. Punishment for disobedience was immediate. And above all, the army was built around speed. A Mongol force could travel distances that conventional armies simply could not match. They carried minimal baggage. They lived off their herds. And they fought as coordinated formations across vast distances, communicating through signal flags, horns, and disciplined maneuver. But by the late 1210s, Genghis Khan's ambitions had begun shifting. The Mongol state had stabilized the steppe. Its enemies among rival tribes had been crushed. Now the question was no longer survival. It was expansion. And the wealth of Central Asia was impossible to ignore. To the southwest lay the Khwarazmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II. Muhammad had inherited a rapidly expanding kingdom built by his predecessors. Over the previous decades, Khwarazmian rulers had pushed outward into Persia, Afghanistan, and Transoxiana, consolidating control over many of the major cities of the Silk Road. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and Merv were centers of culture and commerce. Their walls were strong, their treasuries were full, and their armies were large. But beneath the surface of this prosperity, the empire carried deep structural weaknesses. The Shah ruled over a diverse population of Persians, Turks, and local dynasties, who often maintained their own regional power bases. Governors commanded personal armies. Cities were semi-autonomous. And loyalty to the central authority of the Shah was uneven. More importantly, Shah Muhammad himself ruled with suspicion and insecurity. He trusted few of his commanders, and he often shifted power between governors in ways that created instability inside his own empire. This internal fragility would become crucial when the Mongols arrived. But in 1218, none of this seemed immediately threatening, because at that moment the Mongols were not yet enemies. They were potential trading partners. Genghis Khan initially approached the Khwarazmian Empire not as a conqueror, but as a merchant prince. He understood the value of the Silk Road. Trade meant wealth, and wealth strengthened empires. In 1218, he sent a large caravan of merchants westward into Khwarazmian territory. The caravan carried goods, envoys, and official messages declaring peaceful commercial intentions. Its destination was the frontier city of Otrar. Otrar stood along the Sir Darya River, one of the main gateway points between the steppe and the urban world of Central Asia. The city's governor, Inalchuk, held enormous authority there. When the Mongol caravan arrived, the governor made a decision that would change history. Suspicious of Mongol intentions, or perhaps tempted by the caravan's wealth. Inalchuq ordered the merchants arrested. Their goods were confiscated, and eventually the entire caravan was executed. Hundreds of traders and envoys were killed. In steppe diplomacy, this was not simply a crime. It was an unforgivable insult. Among the Mongols, envoys were sacred. Their protection was absolute. To harm them meant declaring war. Genghis Khan did not immediately respond with invasion. Instead, he sent a diplomatic delegation to Shah Muhammad himself. The message was simple: punish the governor of Otrar. Hand him over for justice. Restore the confiscated goods. Preserve peace. For a moment, the fate of Central Asia hung on the Shah's decision. Muhammad faced a difficult political calculation. Admitting wrongdoing could be seen as weakness. Executing one of his own governors might destabilize authority within the empire. But rejecting Mongol demands risked provoking a powerful military force whose capabilities were still poorly understood. In the end, Muhammad chose defiance. He refused to punish the governor. And then he made the decision that sealed the empire's fate. The Mongol envoys were executed. Their heads were sent back east.
When news of the executions reached Genghis Khan, the situation changed instantly. Diplomacy ended. Preparation for war began. The Mongol leader reportedly spent several days in silent reflection before issuing orders. Then the machinery of conquest started moving. Across the steppe, riders carried messages to every Mongol commander. Tribal units began gathering. Horse herds were organized. Supply animals were assembled, and reconnaissance scouts began moving westward, mapping the terrain of the coming invasion. Unlike many rulers of sedentary empires, Genghis Khan did not rush blindly into conflict. He planned campaigns with extraordinary precision. Before the first Mongol army crossed the frontier, the leadership already understood the geography, the cities, and the internal divisions of their enemy. Spies and traders had been gathering intelligence for years. They knew the river systems. They knew the road networks. They knew which governors were loyal and which might betray the Shah if given a chance. Most importantly, they understood the psychological terrain. The Khwarazmian Empire was large, but it was not unified. Fear could fracture it, and the Mongols knew how to weaponize fear. In the spring of 1219, the largest army ever assembled by the Mongols began moving towards Central Asia. Modern historians estimate the invasion force may have numbered between 100,000 and 150,000 mounted warriors. For a nomadic empire, this was an enormous mobilization. But numbers alone did not define Mongol power. What made the army terrifying was its structure. The invasion was divided into multiple independent columns. Each army would move separately across vast distances. Each commander had clear objectives, and all of them operated within a larger strategic design created by Genghis Khan himself. This allowed the Mongols to strike across a massive front simultaneously. Cities could not predict where the main attack would come. Armies could not concentrate against a single invading force. By the time defenders understood what was happening, the Mongols were already deep inside their territory. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad began preparing his defense. But his strategy revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. Rather than concentrating his forces into a single large army capable of confronting the Mongols in open battle, the Shah chose to disperse his troops among the empire's fortified cities. He believed strong walls would stop the invaders. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand had enormous fortifications. Their garrisons were large. Their supplies were deep. From the Shah's perspective, the Mongols were steppe raiders, excellent horsemen, but inexperienced in siege warfare. If the cities held, the invasion would fail. What Muhammad did not realize was that the Mongols had already adapted. During earlier campaigns in northern China, they had captured engineers, siege specialists, and artillery knowledge. They knew how to break walls, and they knew how to isolate cities before those walls could matter. By late 1219, the Mongol armies began crossing into Khwarazmian territory. The invasion did not resemble a traditional frontier war. There was no single advancing army, no slow, predictable movement of troops along established roads. Instead, the Mongols appeared everywhere at once. Columns swept across deserts. Others crossed mountain passes. Scouting units moved hundreds of kilometers ahead of the main forces. Local resistance collapsed quickly. Frontier garrisons were destroyed before they could send warnings. Communication inside the Khwarazmian Empire began to break down. Governors received conflicting reports. Some cities believed the Mongols were far away. Others suddenly found them at their gates. The campaign was unfolding exactly as Genghis Khan intended. The empire was being psychologically disoriented before the main battles had even begun. And at the center of the coming storm stood the great cities of Transoxina, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, the wealthiest urban centers in Central Asia. Within months, they would face an army that moved faster than any enemy they had ever encountered. And once the Mongols reached their walls, the true scale of the disaster would begin to unfold. By the winter of 1219, the invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire was no longer a distant threat. It was unfolding simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers of frontier. Mongol columns were already deep inside the empire's northern territories, advancing along multiple axes with deliberate coordination. To observers inside the Khwarazmian cities, the situation appeared chaotic and confusing. Reports arrived from different directions. Some spoke of Mongol forces moving along the Sir Daria, others of cavalry emerging from the desert routes that few armies had ever attempted to cross. But the movements were not chaotic. They were carefully designed. At the center of the operation stood Genghis Khan himself, commanding the main army moving toward the wealthy cities of Transoxina. Alongside him were his most trusted generals and sons, Joki, Chagatai, Ogidii, and commanders like Subutai, men who had spent decades fighting together and understood the discipline required to execute large-scale maneuver warfare across vast distances. Each column had a specific task. Some were meant to isolate major cities. Others were tasked with destroying field armies before they could concentrate. Still others were meant to penetrate deep into enemy territory and collapse the psychological confidence of the empire's leadership. This was not a simple invasion. It was a coordinated dismantling of an entire political system. The Mongol army itself was built around extraordinary operational mobility. Each warrior typically traveled with several horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and maintain high speed over long distances. A Mongol force could ride for days without slowing, covering terrain that conventional armies would require weeks to traverse. Their equipment was simple but highly effective. Composite bows made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew gave Mongol archers immense power and range. These bows could penetrate armor at distances where most enemy archers were already ineffective. Every warrior carried multiple quivers. Arrows varied in purpose, some designed for long-range volleys, others with heavier heads for armor penetration, and still others meant to signal commands through distinctive whistles. Their armor was lightweight lamellar, constructed from overlapping plates of leather or iron, allowing protection without sacrificing mobility. Most importantly, Mongol units fought as disciplined formations rather than loose bands of cavalry. They moved in coordinated waves. They could feign retreat with remarkable precision, and they communicated constantly through banners and horns that allowed commanders to shift entire formations during battle. Against scattered defenders, this system was devastating. Inside the Khwarazmian Empire, the response to the invasion revealed deep weaknesses. Shah Muhammad II had chosen to disperse his forces across major cities rather than concentrate them into a unified field army. Samarkand alone reportedly held tens of thousands of soldiers. Bukhara had its own garrison. Urgench, the capital near the Amu Darya River, possessed even larger defensive forces. In theory, this network of fortified cities should have slowed the Mongol advance. In practice, it created isolation. Each city faced an invasion alone. No central army existed to challenge the Mongols in open battle. And communication between governors deteriorated rapidly as Mongol raiding parties cut roads and intercepted messengers. Within weeks of the invasion's beginning, the Khwarazmian defensive strategy had begun to collapse. The first major objective for the Mongols was the frontier region along the Sir Daria River, where several important cities guarded the approaches to Transoxina. Among these was Otrar, the same city whose governor had executed the Mongol caravan. For Genghis Khan, its fate carried symbolic weight. Punishment would be absolute. The Mongol army surrounded Otrar and began a prolonged siege. Unlike earlier steppe campaigns, this assault relied heavily on engineering expertise acquired during Mongol wars in northern China. Captured engineers constructed siege engines, catapults, and battering devices capable of breaking fortified walls. Trenches were dug, supply routes were cut, and Mongol cavalry patrolled the surrounding countryside to ensure no relief forces could reach the city. The siege lasted for months. Inside the walls, defenders held out with determination, but isolation slowly eroded their position. Eventually, betrayal from within the city allowed Mongol troops to enter. Once the defenses collapsed, the governor in Nalchuk was captured. Historical accounts describe his execution as deliberately symbolic, punishment not only for rebellion, but for the murder of Mongol envoys. With Otru destroyed, the gateway into Transoxina stood open. The campaign accelerated. Rather than concentrate their entire army on a single city, the Mongols now split their forces again. Genghis Khan led the main column southward toward Bukhara, one of the most important urban centers in Central Asia. Another force moved toward Samarkand, the empire's richest city and symbolic heart of Khwarazmian power. Still others moved along the river valleys, capturing smaller settlements and preventing any attempt to regroup. To defenders inside Bukhara, the Mongol arrival seemed sudden and almost impossible. The city had believed itself protected by distance and by the defensive system of surrounding territories. Yet in early 1220, Mongol cavalry appeared outside its walls. Their speed had bypassed multiple defensive lines. The city had little time to prepare. Bukhara's defenses relied on thick walls and a large citadel garrison. But the psychological pressure of the Mongol advance had already begun affecting the defenders. Many soldiers inside the city were drawn from different regions of the empire. Their loyalty to the Shah was uncertain, and news of Mongol victories along the frontier had spread rapidly. When the siege began, resistance was uneven. The Mongols surrounded the city and began constructing siege positions. Catapults were deployed. Siege towers were built. But just as important as physical pressure was the psychological warfare. The Mongols deliberately allowed refugees and survivors from earlier battles to spread stories of what happened to cities that resisted. Executions, mass destruction, complete annihilation. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories had a profound effect on defenders. Within days, sections of the city began to collapse internally. Some defenders abandoned their posts. Others attempted negotiations. Eventually, Mongol troops breached the outer defenses. Once the city fell, its citadel garrison continued fighting for several days before finally being overwhelmed. The fall of Bukhara sent shockwaves across the empire. One of the most important cities of Central Asia had fallen with shocking speed. But the Mongol campaign was far from finished. Their next objective was even more significant: Samarkand. Samarkand was not simply another city. It was a political and economic center of the Khwarazmian world. Its walls were immense, its population was large, and its garrison reportedly included tens of thousands of soldiers, reinforced by war elephants brought from territories farther south. For Shah Muhammad, Samarkand represented the strongest defensive position remaining in Transoxina. If the city held, the Mongol invasion might stall. If it fell, the entire region would collapse. But the Shah himself was not present. Fearing encirclement, he had already begun retreating deeper into Persia, attempting to raise additional forces. This absence had a devastating psychological effect on the defenders. Without the presence of the ruler, confidence inside the city weakened. Command structures became uncertain, and the Mongols arrived before the defenders could fully stabilize their position. The siege of Samarkand began with careful preparation. Mongol forces surrounded the city from multiple directions, preventing escape or reinforcement. Engineering units began constructing siege equipment. Meanwhile, cavalry patrols ensured that no Khwarazmian field army could approach the city unnoticed. The defenders attempted several sorties. War elephants were deployed in an effort to break Mongol formations outside the walls. But Mongol archers quickly adapted. Arrows were concentrated on the animals and their handlers. As elephants panicked under sustained missile fire, their formations broke apart, causing confusion among the defending troops. The Mongols then exploited the disorder. Step by step, They tightened their control around the city. And once again, psychological pressure began working against the defenders. Large numbers of soldiers inside Samarkand were foreign mercenaries or recently recruited troops. Their loyalty was fragile. When Mongol forces breached sections of the outer defenses, many defenders began surrendering rather than continuing the fight. Within days, organized resistance inside the city collapsed. Samarkand fell. For the Khwarazmian Empire, the fall of Samarkand was catastrophic. Two of its greatest cities had been destroyed in rapid succession. The Shah himself was now retreating westward, pursued by Mongol detachments determined to eliminate him as a political leader. Across Central Asia, news spread that the Mongol armies were unstoppable. Cities began making desperate calculations. Some attempted resistance. Others surrendered immediately. But the Mongol campaign had entered its most destructive phase, because the destruction of Transoxiana was only the beginning. Farther north, along the Amu Darya River, lay Urgench, the wealthy capital of Khwarazmian Empire. It was one of the richest cities in the Islamic world, and its defense would produce one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire Mongol conquest. By the time Samarkand fell in 1220, the fate of the Khwarazmian Empire had already begun to unravel. Two of its greatest cities had collapsed within months. The frontier defenses were gone. Communication between the remaining provincial governors had broken down almost completely, and the man who was supposed to lead the empire's defense, Shah Muhammad II, was no longer directing the war. Instead of organizing a coordinated resistance, the Shah had begun retreating westward, moving deeper into Persia, while Mongol detachments pursued him across the Iranian plateau. His flight carried devastating psychological consequences. In medieval warfare, rulers were not simply administrators. They were symbols of authority, stability, and divine legitimacy. When a ruler abandoned the core territories of his empire during invasion, the effect was immediate. Confidence collapsed. Governors began thinking about survival rather than strategy. Cities prepared for siege without expecting relief. And in the steppe traditions of warfare, this was exactly the moment when the Mongols intensified their pressure, because now the campaign was no longer about defeating armies. It was about dismantling the entire structure of the Khwarazmian state. While Genghis Khan secured the conquered cities of Transoxiana, other Mongol commanders continued moving deeper into enemy territory. Detachments led by generals like Subutai and Jib pursued Shah Muhammad relentlessly, driving him farther west through Persia. The Shah attempted to regroup several times, hoping to assemble new forces from remaining provincial armies. But the speed of the Mongol pursuit prevented any stable concentration of troops. Every time he moved, Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon. Every attempt to gather reinforcements dissolved into panic. Eventually, Muhammad fled toward the Caspian Sea, seeking refuge on one of its isolated islands. There, in early 1221, the ruler of the Khwarazmian Empire died in exile, his empire already collapsing behind him. But the destruction of Central Asia did not end with his death, because the richest city of the empire still stood, and its fate would be decided through one of the most brutal sieges of the entire Mongol conquest. North of the Amu Darya River stood Urgench, the capital of the Khwarazmian Empire. Unlike many other cities that had already fallen, Urgench possessed enormous wealth, dense urban construction, and a population prepared to resist. It also had strong defensive walls and large numbers of armed defenders. But the geography of Urgench created a unique challenge for the Mongols. The city stood in the delta region of the Amu Darya, surrounded by canals, marshlands, and dense irrigation systems. This terrain limited the mobility that Mongol cavalry normally relied upon. Traditional siege operations would be difficult, and for once, the defenders possessed an environment that complicated Mongol tactics. Recognizing the importance of the city, Genghis Khan assigned several of his senior commanders, including his sons Joki, Chagatai, and Ogedai, to oversee the campaign. Yet even among the Mongol leadership, disagreements began to emerge. Urgench was not a typical siege target. The dense urban layout meant that once the walls were breached, fighting would likely continue street by street. For a cavalry-based army accustomed to open maneuver warfare, urban combat represented one of the most dangerous environments possible. But the Mongols had already committed themselves to destroying the Khwarazmian state. Urgench could not be allowed to survive as a center of resistance. The siege began. Unlike earlier cities that had collapsed quickly under pressure, Urgench resisted fiercely. The defenders understood that surrender offered no guarantee of safety. News from Bukhara and Samarkand had already spread across the region. They knew what Mongol conquest often meant. So the defenders fought with determination. Mongol engineers began constructing siege equipment and assault platforms, but the marshy terrain slowed their efforts. In many areas, the ground could not support heavy machines. Instead, the battle gradually transformed into brutal close combat along the walls and in the surrounding canals. Once sections of city defenses were finally breached, the fighting intensified dramatically. Urgench did not collapse the way earlier cities had. It became a prolonged urban battle. Street fighting spread across the city. Buildings were fortified. Defenders launched repeated counterattacks. Mongol units advanced block by block through narrow streets filled with barricades. This kind of warfare favored the defenders, and casualties among the Mongols rose higher than in most earlier engagements. But the Mongol army possessed overwhelming numbers and relentless discipline. They continued advancing, day by day, street by street. Eventually, organized resistance collapsed. Urgench fell,